got some interesting stuff coming. So I'm glad to be here today. Thanks for having me, ConVerge. One of the nice things about presenting at a conference is you get to make up a title for yourself. So I made up a new title for myself. I'm the intergalactically acclaimed strategic cyber thought leader. So I got all the buzzwords in there that I wanted to get in. And this is a picture I took on the way in from the airport. So I'm glad to be here in Detroit, home of the giant tire. This is also from the airport. I was actually fairly fortunate to get here. I almost was in a car accident on the way to the first airport, almost missed my connection, so I had a lot of difficulty. Fortunately, I got here yesterday. This was a lotto machine inside the airport in Detroit. It said winning, so I'm going to be using this for a lot of memes coming up. All right. So one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here today is what ConVerge is about. This is my first time here at the ConVerge Security Conference. But if you looked at the website, it's all about information sharing and getting people together that are information security, IT, and the business to do security more effectively and learning from one another. That got me really excited because I have a really strong passion for sharing information about security and learning from others. So before I tell you who I am, and I do know who I am, I want to know a little bit more about you. And I think it's important that we all get to know each other a little bit. So I know we all have something in common. We're all here to attend ConVerge. We've all probably over the last week or so captured some Pokemon or had some conversations about Pokemon. And if you don't know what that is, then you've probably been hiding under a rock for the last week. Just out of curiosity, is there anyone here in this room, raise your hand if you're not here for ConVerge or you don't know what Pokemon Go is? One of the two. Okay, so everybody. So I want to thank the volunteers and the organizers of ConVerge. I've put on some conferences before. I volunteered at conferences. It's a lot of hard work to get to the point where you have a great opportunity at a conference like this that's 2 days long. A lot of it will go extremely well, and you won't notice that. There may be some things that don't go quite as well as you'd expect. It's very difficult to run a conference. So as you see the organizers or volunteers over the next couple of days, thank them for their time and effort. They really deserve a round of applause. A couple of things I'd like to do to get to know you better are, I'm wondering who thinks they traveled the furthest of anyone here to get to ConVerge? Anyone travel more than 1,500 miles? 1,000 miles? No one thinks they traveled further than anyone else, or you just have a bunch of shy people. Okay. I traveled from Richmond, Virginia. Did anyone travel from further than Richmond, Virginia? Okay. Where'd you travel from? San Antonio, Texas. Know it well. Used to live there. Anyone travel from further than San Antonio? Okay, so a lot of people that are fairly local. What about those of you that play Pokemon Go? Who thinks they're at the highest level of anyone in the room? Someone shout out a level you're at. I want to see who's at the highest level. Someone's at level 20? Who said that? Level 20. Can anyone top level 20? Pretty impressive. So I know what you're going to be doing for the next couple of days. All right. Just want to get an idea of who you are. So who's never been to ConVerge? Raise your hand if you've never been. Okay, so a lot of first-timers. Who's never been to a security conference at all? Wow. Okay, so quite a few of you. So those of you that are sitting near somebody that's never been to a conference, you might want to give them some tips. Who here is not in the who's not in information security or IT? Can you raise your hand if you're not in information security or IT? Is anyone in audit, compliance, legal? Is anyone a student? Student? Anyone that's in audit, compliance, or legal? Can I see a hand? Okay, so one, a few people. Are there people here that are in IT but not in security? Okay. Of those of you that are in IT, are you all practitioners or any of you IT managers? Raise your hand if you're an IT manager. Okay. So maybe 5 or so. Those of you who are in security, how many of you are not technical practitioners? How many of you are managers or in another role that's not really considered technical? Can you raise your hands? So not very many. So it seems like mostly we have security technical practitioners here, but we have a fairly good mix of other people as well. So myself, currently I'm an enterprise security architect, which is a technical role. I've served in management roles before, so I've been on both sides of the table, also done blue and red, so that's a good question I should ask too. Hopefully, so blue means defense, red means offense, purple means a mix of the two. Who here would consider themselves purple? So a few. We're seeing more people moving that direction in the field. What about red teamers? Can you raise your hand if you're a red teamer? Okay, so most of you are on the defense side. All right, I think that's pretty helpful to know. So now we all have a better idea of who we are, and I have a better idea, which will help give me some context as I move through the presentation. So in terms of who I am, it's actually not super relevant in terms of what I want to talk to you about today. I'm not really talking about anything that I need to really demonstrate my credibility for or my experience with. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details like what degrees I have or what certs I have, all of which are expired, because it's not really relevant. Also, I don't believe very strongly in certs, so I'm not one of those people that feels like somebody has certs or degrees that they're more skilled or experienced than somebody else. I'm not saying that certs aren't a bad thing. I've just made the decision not to continue to get certs and not to continue to pay money to have mine continue to be valid. So in terms of a few things about me, though, that may be a little bit interesting, I have a few numbers up here. So the one represents the number of companies I've had to dissolve. So I ran an IT development company during the dot-com era, and one day I had to go in and dissolve the company and let everybody go, which is an interesting experience. 3 represents the number of years it took between the time that somebody came to my door and said, "You've been served." If you've seen Law and Order, it works just like that. Somebody rang the door and said, "Are you Steve Werby?" I said, "Yes." They handed me a big packet and said, "You've been served." And it had to do with a role I had as a CISO for a state agency. The case of which I was the co-defendant got appealed all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So the 3 represents a number of years there was an active court case or a series of active court cases related to something I did in the due course of my job. The end result is that the case was never actually found successful, and so there was no action that was taken against me. But I can tell you, being a security practitioner and having a court case hanging over your head for 3 years is an interesting experience. In 3 organizations, I served as a CISO, so the 11 represents the number of data breaches that I was leading the security program for, under which we had to perform public notification to those that were affected. 2 of those were particularly interesting. One of them was interesting because it was believed that all or nearly all of those that were affected were deceased. And if you look at data breach notification laws, they specifically relate to notifying citizens. You're no longer a citizen if you're deceased. So that was a pretty odd one to deal with. For another one, which was actually at a university I worked at, I served as the one-person call center. So I had almost 1,000 people call me, and I had to personally respond to them, have conversations related to the data breach. So these were all really fascinating learning experiences, which is part of what made me who I am today. And what the 950 is nothing related to security at all. I use an app called Untappd to track the unique beers that I drink. I got kind of lazy with it. That's the number of unique beers that I've had. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about me. So in a way, this keynote is about success. And success can be defined a lot of different ways. We're not really going to explore what your definition of it is, but in general, success is typically thought of as some level of accomplishment. And it's generally something you're accomplishing towards a target. So some aim you have or some purpose. As a technology practitioner, it could be looked at very simplistically as remediating vulnerabilities, identifying threats. But from an organizational perspective, those types of things don't generally matter to an organization. Organizations tend to be in the business of providing a service, selling a product, having some kind of offering. And security is just one type of risk that they have to manage. So it's important when you think about what your role is and what success is, to understand what the organization considers success and what your part in it is and how well aligned they are. My aim today is actually fairly simplistic. I'm going to share a couple of high-level themes, and I'm going to pose a set of challenges to you. Posing challenges is not very hard. I'm just going to ask you to do something. I'm not actually going to force you to do it. So it should be pretty easy for me to achieve my aim. To give you a couple examples of techniques that I'm going to talk about things such as tricking adversaries, what I call waiting rooms, bait buttons. Some of these are my own terminology, but these are things that I consider unconventional. Some of them are things that some organizations do, but they're not things that you'll commonly hear about, which is why I want to expose you to them today. In terms of unconventional approaches, I'm talking about things that are atypical from a conventional perspective. From a conventional perspective, security has historically been identifying vulnerabilities and doing something about them, identifying incidents and doing something about those in order to mitigate potential impacts, and then threats are usually part of the mix as well. So it's really about identifying threats, identifying vulnerabilities, putting controls into place to prevent the vulnerabilities from being exploited, and then when incidents occur, detecting those incidents as quickly as possible. Or in some cases, it's often better for an organization not to know about an incident. So when you think about success, think about whether your organization is one that actually wants to know about an incident or wants to know about a vulnerability. It's valid for an organization to potentially take that approach. Okay. So before I get into the unconventional, I want to talk a little bit about conventional. And to me, really, there's been many phases of security. I'm really bucketing a couple of decades of security into what I'm calling conventional sec. This is when we focused on identifying vulnerabilities and doing something about them. Doing something about them could be patching, it could be remediating or mitigating a vulnerability, it could be generating a report and sending it to somebody and hoping they're going to do something about it. It could be just identifying vulnerabilities and doing nothing about them because in your organization, you're not empowered to do anything more than identify the vulnerability and do nothing about it. It could be observing that there's attacks. Hopefully you've moved to the point where your organization is trying to predict what kind of attacks may occur and prevent the attacks from occurring, or at least prevent the impacts from occurring or being significant. And then we've evolved to trying to identify incidents and then contain them, recover from them, learn from them, and improve our security posture. So that was really initially what conventional security was, and we decided, well, let's start doing something a little bit more robust. And we decided to focus on basically restricting things. So we restricted access to systems via usernames and credentials and groups. We hardened systems by configuring them a certain way that made us feel good. And we isolated systems when either none of this was possible or that was an additional layer that we decided to approach. And that essentially was the model of the hard outer core and the soft, juicy middle. We then evolved to learning about things called best practices. Now, best practices are something that are not universal. You may have a different best practice than you may have. There may be some things we commonly agree are best practice, like it's best practice to have a strong password. It's not best practice to define what a strong password is. 8 characters, upper and lowercase, a number, and special characters. It's not necessarily a strong password, but it's something that for a long number of years has really been the litmus test for what a strong password is. I would say metrics, but under conventional sec, I would say really what we did was statistics. We measured stuff. It wasn't necessarily the right things. Metrics are supposed to be things that help you take action. A metric should help you understand what's occurring, what the impact is, and what you can do about it. Knowing how many times somebody's been jiggling the doorknob or throwing stones against your window, which may be a brute force attack or an attempt to exploit a vulnerability that you have good remediation and mitigation for, is not really a useful metric, so it's what I would call statistics. So during conventional sec, we measured things. And then we decided it was probably a good idea to have policy. So we wrote down what we expected users to do and what we expected IT system administrators to do and not to do. And then we made those policies available and we hoped that they read them and understood them. And then when we found out they didn't, we did some training. Then we moved on to classifying our data and systems because we recognized that not all systems and all data were equivalent. Some data was worth more to the organization than other data, and some systems were more important than other systems. We didn't necessarily do anything with these classifications, but at least we had classifications in place. Then we did what was actually called risk assessment, but really wasn't necessarily a risk assessment. It really was writing risk down so that we could hand those documents over to people and say, hey, we don't have a way to mitigate this or remediate it, so we're telling you about the risk and now it's your problem. And then we started to get really frustrated and use fear, uncertainty, and doubt to say, hey, the sky's falling. This bad thing happened somewhere else. It could happen to us here. And that really didn't resonate with our stakeholders. So we went to third parties like the Big Four and other organizations. And we said, come in and do a maturity model against us. Assess us from a maturity perspective against other organizations. Tell us, we're doing things ad hoc? Are we writing things down? Do we have good procedures in place? Do we have the right tools? And benchmark us against other organizations. Then we were able to take that to our stakeholders and say, hey, we're not as good as our peers, therefore bad things are going to happen. Now, what we didn't tell them is a lot of our peers we were being benchmarked against also were already having bad things happen, but still it helped us get funding, it helped us get tools. And we demanded more and more tools and FTEs, and we always talked about it as FTEs, full-time equivalents, not people. We needed more FTEs, so that was conventional SEC. And I'm not saying conventional SEC wasn't good. A lot of organizations today are still practicing conventional SEC, and it's certainly a lot better than doing nothing. And you can do conventional SEC very well, or you can do conventional SEC very poorly. So this isn't about right or wrong, it's a spectrum, it's an evolution. So over the last few years, we've been doing next-gen SEC. And when I say doing, I mean the information security industry as a whole. I don't necessarily mean organizations themselves. So this is when we started to focus on whether the configurations of our systems were what we expected, whether the controls that we expected to be in place were actually in place, whereas before we just trusted they were. We started doing red teaming and purple teaming. We did correlation so that we didn't spend a lot of time focusing on responding to attacks that were trying to exploit vulnerabilities that had already been remediated, or for systems that had very low criticality or low sensitivity from a data perspective. Then we moved into more advanced technology, like detonation. This was originally companies like FireEye. So instead of using signature-based technology, we started to run malware and see how it actually worked, because we recognized that the bad guys were more advanced than we were from a defense perspective, and things were good. Then we got into what was called threat intel, and threat intel doesn't just mean a threat data feed, it means a lot more than that, but the reality is most organizations are not ready for threat intel because they haven't even really started to master conventional SEC. But because conventional SEC hasn't been working, and they and other organization stakeholders have heard about next-gen SEC, they've moved on to next-gen SEC. Again, not saying that's right or wrong, that's just what a lot of organizations have done. Then we get into some technology that is really, really hard to understand for a lot of people. We talk about big data, machine learning. It's like calculus and physics and a lot of math and science that's really hard to understand. And it works really well, but the tricky part is to tune it and manage it requires more of those pesky FTEs. You need the right skills and capabilities. So none of this is a magic 8-ball. It's right for the right organization when they're ready. And so I want to talk a little bit again about success and put a little bit more context around it. To me, success really depends on you and organization. When I say success, I mean both for the organization outside of security and IT, for the security organization itself, and for you as an individual. Because it's important that you look at what success is for you as an individual. That might be increasing your skills and capabilities. That might be putting bread on the table at home. You have to really decide what's important to you. But when we talk about what's important to the organization, at least from a security perspective, moving forward, let's use the context of effective security. Let's think about if we are an ideal organization and want to be doing effective security in terms of getting effective results, what we want to do. Here's 4 key attributes that I think are pretty important. We could come up a list of 20 more, but for me, these are 4 that I really focus on day in and day out. And that's the things that we're doing in security, are they defensible? If somebody asks us why we're doing them, can we defend why we chose that particular thing over something else? Is it palatable to the organization? Again, we don't exist from the standpoint of providing security. As an organization, we provide products and services. So if we're preventing the organization from meeting its current goals and mission and long-term strategy, the organization may not consider it palatable. We may have the opportunity to explain how it can be done in a palatable way because they may misunderstand the level of burden, effort, and friction that may be caused, but it's important to consider the level of palatability. Because a lot of these things on paper sound really good, but when it comes down to the end of the day, requires the assistance, executive support, and collaboration of people outside security to make these technologies and approaches work. So they have to be palatable to the people that are going to do them and give you support. You also need credibility. And to give an example of credibility, think about some of the big things that happened over the last couple years, like Heartbleed, shell shock, ransomware. If somebody came to you and stopped you in the hallway at work, somebody that was in IT or somebody outside of IT and said, hey, I heard about shell shock on the news on CNN yesterday. You didn't know what it was. Your credibility is probably going to be pretty low because they heard about it on local TV. They read about it in USA Today. So it's important to stay in touch with what your stakeholders are reading and seeing, even if it's mainstream media. It's important to know what's happening in mainstream media. You definitely have more credibility if you can answer the question and say, I know what shell shock is, here's what it means to us, here's what we're doing about it, or here's what we can do about it. It's also even better if when you know that kind of thing is getting mainstream attention, you have a mechanism for sharing that with the organization, or at least the right stakeholders, so that they're not coming to you and telling you about security issues. You're coming to them and saying, I'm aware of this thing. We don't have a solution for it. We're looking into it. It's on our roadmap, but it was number 83 on the list, and you didn't give us resources for it. Here's what we can do. And use that as an example. Keep it in the back pocket. Or tell them what's going on. And then efficacy is a really tricky one, because that's really in the eye of the beholder. But if you're doing something and it's not working at all, then it's not effective. Okay, so unconventional SEC is essentially taking approaches that are not conventional. So I'm not going to go into any definitions there. Let's just kick into the first example. So when we think about phishing, a lot of phishing comes in via email. And a lot of the approaches that we have historically taken are content filtering to block known websites and web pages that have phishing forms where people will enter in a username and password, blocking emails from low reputation sources, detecting phishing emails after they come in and educating users not to click on the phishing email, doing a lot of things that are very reactive or very technologically focused, combined with educating users on what phishing is and telling them what it looks like and what to do and what not to do. And that's worked to a large degree. Unfortunately, unless it's a whaling attack, meaning that the attack is targeting a specific individual or individuals in a specific role, it's a really bad numbers game. So you can pat yourself on the back and say, yes, everything we've done via our phishing testing has demonstrated that we've gone from 85% of our users responding to phishing attacks to 25%. Unfortunately, 25% is probably too much, because as long as they get a foothold in, they're probably able to get to the targets they want to get to. So I've come up with an approach, and I'm not saying I invented it, because there are likely others that are doing it, that I call a black hole. And what I did was I thought about phishing a completely different way. I assumed that those controls were going to be somewhat effective, but they were largely going to fail. And I thought more about phishing in general and what actually happens. And the end result is, generally, somebody is responding to an email, including their credentials, or they're going to an external web page and entering their credentials. So I thought, even if we didn't know which emails are the ones that are phishing responses, or what web pages are the ones that are phishing responses, could we just collect all the information from a large collection of web pages people are posting form data to or sending emails to, and parse them, and then use the information that was parsed against our authentication system? And it's really not that hard to do. So what I'm talking about is having in your proxy, and this would require for SSL some SSL inspection, because a lot of the attacks will be posting to TLS, SSL enabled web pages. So it's not as easy as it used to be. But if you can capture all the information that's being posted via a form, and you can basically explode out all the strings, and you knew who the user was that submitted the information, you could then just take all that and enumerate it and send it to your authentication system and say, log in. Now, you probably wouldn't want to do that against your live authentication system. You probably want to set up a parallel version. You could do the same thing for email as well. And if you detect that you can log in, that tells you that the password did appear in that user's email or form they posted. Whether they respond to a phishing email is not necessarily true, but it's a unique false positive situation because it meant that they actually posted a form or sent an email with their password in it. They could have sent the password to their wife or a coworker. It could be that they posted it in a form because their password is just something that's not very unique. It's something every day. But regardless, you've now detected that they've shared their password. And if you take action like disabling their account or forcing them to change their password, you've now reduced the window with which the attacker can leverage that information. So it's a completely different way of approaching security. So if you're able to leverage that effectively, it doesn't matter if people respond to phishing attacks. And there's a lot of caveats there. I'm not saying it's going to solve 100% of the problem. You could also expand upon that and take those passwords and put them in the blacklist because you could probably assume the attackers are going to use them again. They might also use them against other usernames in your system, assuming that some users may also have the same password. So there's a lot more you can do with it. So the story of the scorpion and the frog, in short, is the frog knew the scorpion likes to bite frogs and sting them and kill them. The scorpion wanted to ride on the frog's back across the river. The frog said, hey, I know you're a scorpion, you're going to bite me. And the scorpion said, no, I wouldn't do that because that'd kill us both. Hops on the frog's back, stings the frog. The frog said, hey, why did you do that? You're going to kill us both. You said you wouldn't do that. And he said, you knew I was a scorpion. So this is really a story about knowing typical behavior, both for your users and for your adversaries. So I already gave an example of that with phishing. We know that the adversaries know that a lot of people have the same password, reuse it everywhere. So use that information to your advantage when you're thinking about how to defeat your adversaries or understand and mitigate what your user's behavior is. Instead of talking about a password, I'll just give a simplistic example of how you can use this information. Think about a PIN code. Most PIN codes are 4 digits. There's a lot of empirical evidence that people that create PIN codes reuse them. They also fairly often create a PIN code that's based on the last 4 of their social, last 4 of a phone number, or a year of some relevance, which means that a compromise of a system unrelated to your organization's could potentially result in a compromise in your organization. And there's not really much you can do about it that's very easy. But one thing you can do is recognize this is user behavior and adversary behavior and change your policy and approach. Simply by requiring a 5-digit PIN, you'll be magnitudes better off than if you had a 4-digit PIN. You'll still be in a fairly bad shape, but a whole lot better off. And in some cases, when you're trying to defeat opportunistic attacks, that's enough to ensure that your systems are safe. So pay strong attention to your users and your adversaries in terms of what their behavior is. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about how you can use crowdsourcing. So another risk, and some of what I'm talking about now is authentication related. Another risk relates to when somebody forgets how to get into an account, how they get back in. Pretty often, one of 2 mechanisms are used, sometimes both. The user contacts a help desk or goes online, answers a security question that's pretty weak and potentially easily guessable, or they have a code sent to an email, which is potentially compromised. The security questions, if you don't know how your organization operates, sometimes the people you're talking to will actually tell the end user the answer to the question, give them hints. There's a lot of ways that is flawed, but because people want things right away, organizations have said, we need to give people self-service and a quick way to get access to their account again. I would say, challenge that. Is 5 minutes acceptable? Is an hour acceptable? Or does it have to be 5 seconds? Because you can potentially do things like use crowdsourcing. In its most simplest form, it's not crowdsourcing, it's validating that the person who's making the request is who they say they are. One way to do that is have a workflow that requires that the manager verify that the person contacting the help desk or used online self-service is who they said they are. Hey, Steve, just got an email. Says that you put in a forgotten password request. Was that you? Nope. Oh, okay, I'm going to click this button here and deny the request. Could be some colleagues at work. You could automatically send an email out to 5 colleagues and say, hey, we're going to make this person wait 4 hours to have their password reset. If you want to help them get it reset sooner, any 2 of you can validate their identity. So you're really crowdsourcing identity verification. Part of what I talked about was delaying things. So this is a waiting room. There's a lot of things you can do from a security perspective if you delay the action that can have the adverse effect until you are sure that you want to take that particular action. Too often when we want to automate or provide good customer service, we want to do things right away. But because adversaries can cause a lot of damage in a very short amount of time, potentially 30 minutes after which you've detected the incident, it's too late. The damage has been done. And so you have the opportunity to choose wisely and decide for a potential critical system or for a stakeholder that has a lower level of risk tolerance, you can make these options available for them and say, hey, we can do some things if you're willing to tolerate a little less customer experience. All right, this is a sleeping bear, but let's pretend he's a hibernating bear. So a lot of our systems are up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Everybody has access to the system. Once they're provisioned access, has access indefinitely, and they have access to all the functions within the system, even if the system has the most sensitive data in the organization, or the system's extremely critical, even if the system is only used once per year for financial purposes and is highly vulnerable. There's a different way you can do things. Think about the context. If you have a system that's only used once per year, it's highly vulnerable, either the system overall or some service within it, or there's users that only need to access it very infrequently or a particular part of the system very infrequently, you can have it all turned off. You could potentially have the whole server or application turned off. There is no attack surface for a system that is not on. If it's on, but it's only accessible to IP addresses of a certain few users during a certain amount of time, or users are provisioned real-time access to a system, then deprovision access, the ability to exploit vulnerabilities or misuse a system goes down substantially. And today, there's a lot of systems you may have in your organization, like ServiceNow, other systems like that would allow you to potentially do this kind of orchestration to ensure that a user is taking the step to say, hey, I want access, potentially with or without some management approval, potentially with or without correlating it to a change record that's already been approved. So think about the systems you have in your environment, whether there's any opportunity to have something less than the entire system turned on all the time for all data, for all users indefinitely. Okay. You can set booby traps. Now, Indiana Jones had a fair idea that this was a booby trap, so he was pretty ready for it. Think about some of the things that happen in your organization. Devices like phones or laptops get stolen, and you don't often know that they did, especially in a BYOD world or a world where you're just not in the loop in terms of a device getting stolen. You maybe find out 5 days after the fact. But if you had an icon on your users' phones that they know never click this icon, and all that it did was send a message to one of your systems, and you had an MDM technology, that basically could tell you that somebody who's an adversary has now gotten control of the device. So I'm talking about like a really compelling icon that says this is the really sensitive system with all the data. It doesn't really matter what it says. It doesn't have to do anything all that powerful. It just needs to lure the user in, the adversary, into taking some action like clicking a link. You could also do that on a desktop. So you can do remote wiping and other things based on that. And if you combine this with one of the approaches I mentioned earlier, the buffering or waiting room type approach, assuming the user that was authorized accidentally did it, someone could be notified, it could be overridden, they could be contacted out of band. And so the potential adverse impact that you'd want to avoid could be avoided. So you have to think about these things really more holistically. You can also do this with things like a folder in email. a folder that the user has no business going into. You can do this with on-prem and cloud-hosted technologies. It's fairly easy to monitor whether a folder's been opened or an email's been read. So just think of these things as early indicators that somebody bad has gotten access to a system or an application or data. And now you've been notified about it and you have an opportunity to put in some action either manually, semi-automatically, or automatically. Okay. Kind of along those lines, a canary in the coal mine, kind of things you can do there are create admin accounts that aren't actually being used, put files on your system that you monitor to see if they've been modified, deleted, encrypted. So it could help you identify that something like ransomware is taking place. Now, ransomware typically is going to start the first directory in your file repository, the first file alphabetically. They're smart. Maybe they start with the letter Z. So you could place some of these canaries in strategic locations instead of having to monitor across hundreds or thousands of files and put the burden in of that level of logging. There's not really a downside because it doesn't cost you anything to put these type of controls in place. You probably don't even need anybody's permission. It's either going to work or it's not, so you gain some learnings. And if you start small and you get no buy-in to do this bigger, something bad may happen. You'll now be able to say, see, the bad thing did happen. I now have evidence that we're not a unique snowflake. We're like every other organization. I'd now like to expand this. There's some things you can do to scare adversaries. I'm actually going to skip over that, but just think about all the data available to you via JavaScript about the user and their device and their geolocation. And think about potentially popping up for them their location, the location of the nearest police precinct, putting a scary message. Now, if it's an opportunistic or unsophisticated attacker, that might make them stop. If it's a sophisticated attacker, it might actually let them say challenge accepted. All right, so those are my technical examples, and I'm going to wrap things up with talking a little bit more about questions that I recommend you consider asking yourself as you're thinking about security. So I mentioned this earlier. What do you expect to achieve? And is what you've done achieving what was expected? And to take that a step further, if you put a control in place 10 years ago, let's say 8-character password has to change every 90 days, and you felt good about it 10 years ago because of what the threat and impact environment was, are those constraints, requirements, and risks still the same today? They may not be. So it's probably worth revisiting whether the decisions that were made in the past that maybe were right are still right today. So I want to talk about a couple of these here, and the context really matters because if we think about a particular system, what is important for one system may not be important for another, and that's part of what we frustrate people within IT and within the organization outside of IT with is we see things as one size fits all. And to a degree, it's a trade-off because simplicity is our friend, and so we have to decide to what degree we want to be granular and what degree we want to be simplistic. I think a tiered hybrid approach is appropriate. It takes a while to get there, but what we found is in the industry, or what I've seen and what most people I've talked to have observed is the more granular we've gotten, the less we understand whether the controls we have in place are what we expect them to be. Are they really in place? Are they effective? Are they being implemented at all? Are they being understood? Do we even understand them? We know there's firewall rules, but they're not commented. Do we really understand what we actually have? And so simplicity could actually be better than complexity. All right, so inactivity timeout. There's really a couple places you can do that. You can do it on a device. You can do it in an application. But if you ask yourself what the point is, one of the main points from a device perspective is if I walk away from the device, hopefully if a bad guy is going to come get access to my device, he's going to wait 15 minutes, not get access 14 minutes after I left my device because he's in. So if we think about what we're trying to achieve, it may make us feel good, and it will actually provide some values, a belt and suspenders type control, so that if something bad does happen, we can say, hey, we have no evidence that the person got in there within 15 minutes, so we're pretty sure the data is safe. And so it does have some value. But if we want to ensure that your malicious coworker, somebody that has access to the computer when you went to the bathroom and forgot to lock it, doesn't get access to the system, maybe there's a way to actually lock the device without you having to take action. And there are ways to do that with proximity-based devices. So there are applications you can install on your phone via Bluetooth and other mechanisms can detect you've moved far enough away from the device that the device isn't able to ping it, and it will lock the device. There's also hardware that can do that, and it works pretty well. And as long as the device stays in the user's pocket and is not with the laptop, provides a fairly high level of efficacy. Password expirations are fairly interesting because they've actually led to unintended consequences. But I'm going to talk about unintended consequences in a bit. Patching. So we all know we should do patching, but for a long time we've been patching once a year, every 90 days, every 30 days. Sometimes every 30 days means 30 days with the start point being the point at which the vendor released the patch. Sometimes it just means it's something we do every 30 days on the calendar, and maybe we're pushing out a patch that is 2 years old, but we're doing it every 30 days. We're always 2 years behind, but it's every 30 days, so we're good. The policy shouldn't have been worded that way if they didn't want us to do that. Well, 10 years ago, it was fairly hard to exploit vulnerabilities. I'm just using 10 as a round number. Now it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to go on the black or gray market, get rootkits, get exploit kits. There's malware as a service. So you don't even have to really know what you're doing. And ignoring O-days, vulnerabilities that are announced at the same time that there's a patch, even if it's not clear how to exploit the vulnerability. If the software is widely used or vulnerability is easy to reverse, you can probably expect it could be very quick, less than a day or a few days between the time the vulnerability is announced, the patch is out there, and there's an exploit kit in the wild, either via a project like Metasploit or just from adversaries who are using it from a black hat perspective. So, is patching really providing us a lot of value? I think it really depends on the context. If you take something like Flash, and let's say that on average every 5 days, after there's a Flash update, there's exploits for that vulnerability. If you're patching every 30 days, you're giving yourself a 25-day window of exploitability. That's not very good. So you're really only buying, you're not really buying yourself a lot of time. And now if you're not patching that frequently, or you're patching to an older version that's already vulnerable with malware that's already out there, then you're not really doing anything at all except patting yourself on the back and improving some of your statistics. Because if the goal of patch management is to reduce the exploitation of vulnerabilities against the systems that you really have in your environment, that's not necessarily helping you. And if there's always vulnerabilities on your systems that are ones that are not patched, because you're only patching the OS, or you're only patching Adobe products and Oracle products, you may not be providing the value that you hope that you're providing. And sometimes that's because of resource restrictions, and so I'm not saying don't patch, but think about what the efficacy is and whether it makes sense to take a different approach. Maybe the patching isn't the right thing for you to do. In terms of unintended consequences, failed login account locking is pretty common. I really hate this control. Because basically what you're doing is you're giving the adversaries a way to lock Steve Werby's account out. Steve Werby doesn't like that. So if you know my username, you're giving the attackers a way to lock out my account. Especially if there's an authentication service that's on the public internet, and that affects my ability even on the intranet to log in. And if the attacker can get all the usernames, you're potentially giving them away via something like PowerShell to very quickly lock out every single account in the environment. Potentially not just user accounts, but privileged and system accounts as well. So I would say, think about that control you have in place. If you don't even know whether you have that in place or what the settings are, take a look at it and ask your IT colleagues what is actually in place and what are they experiencing. And ask the question, if this happened, what would we actually do? What would actually happen to us? I can say in some organizations, it brings down production and they lose millions of dollars. So they're not necessarily having strong success with that type of approach. And if we look at authentication attacks today, they're largely not happening against online systems. So it's not really necessarily providing you a lot of value. Password expiration really results in users creating more simplistic passwords that follow guessable patterns. So you're actually making it easier for the adversaries to gain access and regain access to your systems. I'll skip Java except to say deployment rule sets and user agent content filtering. The applications you have that need to run very old Java can be configured so they can, but all of these sites that are going to exploit your environment won't get access to those old versions of Java. The new versions of Java are fairly secure. If you have a laptop that's going to China, you typically have it come back and you wipe it. But what if the hardware, firmware, BIOS have been modified? Do you have tamper tape on it? Do you weigh it to see if it weighs the same? Even if it weighs the same, does that tell you the hardware was not modified? Probably not. Why not just take that laptop and sell it on eBay? Why not just shred it? Because if you shred that laptop for the infrequent times that people visit these hostile countries, it'll probably cost you less money than the effective controls that you would put into place. Now, the organization may laugh, but if you showed them the numbers, at least you would have something defensible. All right, these last two here are really just to say if somebody asks you in the hallway, hey, what if our password database is published? What would that actually mean to us? Are we in good shape if that happened? How would we respond? What if we had ransomware? Do we back up all our data? How much would we lose? Make sure you know enough about your environment to answer those questions. All right, so I want to wrap up with 4 challenges. The first one is not really specific to this conference. It really relates to know your environment. If you don't know what the impacts are that could occur from a technical and business perspective, what the general threats are that you should be worried about in your environment. I both mean the sources of threats and the attack vectors. You don't know your environment, like, are things being backed up? Are people going these kind of sites? Are people using Java? Do we have systems that are highly vulnerable? And you don't know what success is to you in the organization, you're really working from a bad starting point. Then the rest of what you can do is things you can control and influence. You don't have a lot of control over everything, but you at least have the ability to influence. You can tell the organization, there's a bad thing that can happen. I don't think it's highly likely, but here's what we could do about it. And then when a shell shock or heartbleed or cryptolocker show up, you can say, talk to you about it. Here's what we can do about it. We're ready to go, or we're not ready to go, but here's what we would do. And there's so many things you can't control. It's probably not that much value to worry about those things. You should be aware of them, but you spend all your time ranting and raving about the things you can't control, time and effort you could spend on things you can control, and it's not going to help you be successful. All right. So the first real challenge is to step outside your comfort zone. Now, I know a lot of you have done that because this is your first time at a security conference, so congratulations. You step outside your comfort zone, learn a lot from the sessions, learn a lot from the people you talk with, share information with others, get to know people. And attend a session you normally wouldn't. So if you only attend sessions that have the new sexy hot, because you're a breaker, go to one that's defense related. Go to something you would not normally go to because it may expose you to a different technology or way of thinking that you wouldn't otherwise come across. So you spend all your time in the echo chamber, you're only going to see a very limited part of what others see. And the way I get a lot of value is I talk to a lot of people that are smarter than me, more experienced than me, and they're just in different domains and organizations than I am. Introduce yourself to somebody new. You may learn a lot. Don't just talk to people that you know here. All right. Share something. I've shared some information with you. It's not all rocket science. You may have something small. You may have something big. I want to hear from you after this meeting. I'm glad to share more with you. Want to hear from you. I want to learn from you. Share something, at least one thing with somebody else during the conference, even if you think it's pretty minor. Even if it's just a problem or idea you have and you don't know if it'll work. All right. So my last and final challenge for you is to take one of the ideas or approaches that you learn during ConVerge and pursue it. And I've learned, at least for me, and a lot of you are probably the same way, to pursue something. You get a lot of excitement from a conference like this, get a lot of good ideas, you plan on doing something with it, completely forget until the next conference you go to and keep going through that cycle. So I encourage you to do what I do. Write the idea down. Write a commitment to yourself that I'm going to do something about an idea. I'm going to pursue one of these approaches. I don't necessarily know which one it is. I'm going to give myself a deadline like Labor Day. And put it on a sticky note, put it on your computer, do whatever you have to do to make sure it's prominent. And hold yourself accountable for that. And then share what you learned. love to see on social media you share that you tried something new. It gives me a lot of excitement if you contact me and said, hey, one of the things you tried or told me about or something else I learned, here's what I tried and here's what I learned from it. That would make me feel really great. All right, so this was what my aim is. I think I did a decent job at it because my goal wasn't really that high. So hopefully I achieved it. And the last thing I want to leave you with is this fascinating definition of a hacker by Stephen Levy. It was from an article in Computer World. Don't have the date handy. Something like 1982. Right? So this is his definition. He was asked, what is a hacker? Hacker is a person whose devotion to something, in this case computers, is near total, and who has a deep-seated desire to do what's impossible. I think the great thing about hackers is that quite often they achieve is what is considered impossible because they refuse to accept limits. I guess the other aspects of hackerism, which is a word we need to bring back, is an insatiable quest for information and knowledge. And this is not a hacker conference per se, it's a security conference. But I think whether you're in security or whatever field you're in, this really resonates with me, and I hope it resonates with you, because I think it's something that we've lost in the hacker and security community. This deep-seated desire to do what's impossible versus using best practice and the tools that are available, and refusing to accept limits. The desire to think differently and beyond how we would normally think. The quest for knowledge, learning from others and learning what's out there and trying new things. I think it's something that we've largely lost. So I'm hoping you'll think about this and the challenges that I laid out today, and think about it as you attend the rest of the conference. I think I am out of time in 40 seconds, so I'm dropping my virtual mic. Appreciate your time. Thank you.